Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. That was a very kind introduction. I'm very flattered. Let me get my slides up. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it. Thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, awesome. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Today, I am going to be talking about a project that I ran in East and Southern Africa, where we looked at how improving women's access to energy, specifically in the form of cooking energy, can potentially improve women's economic outcomes, their various measures of women's empowerment, and then labor productivity as well. So let's talk briefly about what the problem is. So 3 billion people around the world rely on solid biomass fuels, which are things like firewood and charcoal, so essentially things that are procured from the environment. And they rely on these for their daily needs, so things like cooking, heating the household, and cleaning, so things that we often rely on electricity for. They rely on firewood that they actively collect. And so the issue here, first of all, actually, I want to point out how large of a number that is, because I think 3 billion, relative to the world's population, which is around, I think, 8 billion people, that's about 38% of the world's population that's relying on firewood. So these fuels are very time and energy intensive to collect. So imagine walking to a forest multiple times a week, chopping down firewood, either hauling it on your back, or maybe you have a bicycle and coming all the way back home. Importantly, in many of these contexts, women spend a disproportionate amount of time relative to other members of the household on firewood collection. One study found that women in Sub-Saharan Africa on average spent 180 to 261 minutes per day on fuel collection. Another study found that the cost of all of this time that was being lost to collection is in the tens of millions of worker years annually. So this is a lot of time that's being spent on firewood collection that could potentially be spent on other activities. So what we see in the literature is that when women save time, that time is redirected to 3 different places. 1, to rest and leisure, so getting to relax a little bit more in their household. 2, to income generation. So studies find that when paid labor opportunities are available, women will take them and potentially increase the income that they're having for themselves as well as for their families. And then lastly, we see investment in education, both their own education as well as their children's education. So a lot of potential positives from transitioning to better forms of energy access. So let's talk about cooking energy specifically. So what we see here is actually a cook stove. It's called a traditional 3-stone fire, and this is what a large population of rural Sub-Saharan Africa uses to cook with. Let me see if this video will work. Okay, so I took this video in Kenya, I believe, and you can see that it's literally 3 stones with some firewood placed between those stones, and then she lights it up. So first of all, you're going to see the smoke coming out of this stove very quickly. Note that most of these cook stoves are in enclosed kitchens, so enclosed spaces. So you can imagine how that could be damaging to health. You can imagine that it's environmentally damaging as well. And then lastly, of course, it's time intensive to use, both to collect the wood as well as to cook with it. So another issue that these women face when using these cook stoves is that oftentimes the fire gets too big, the food might burn, or the fire will go out. And so it takes a long time to cook. So where we can, let's say we're cooking in our kitchens, we can walk away, maybe take care of a kid or sweep the floor, do something else and come back. It's not really an option here. So it also takes away from the ability to multitask. So one solution to this problem is to switch to an improved cook stove. So an improved cook stove is any type of cook stove that is either more efficient or cleaner than the cook stove that we just saw here. And the idea is that these new cook stoves can help reduce the time and labor that is spent on fuel collection, fuel preparation, and cooking. Okay, so let's talk about our study. The primary goal of this research was to quantify exactly how much time is saved, as well as various measures of gender empowerment and labor productivity when women receive an improved cook stove. Some of the sort of outcomes that are related to saving time that we explore are effects on household income. These are all very agricultural societies that we surveyed, so changes to agricultural output. And then, as I've said, measures of gender empowerment. This could include things like labor force participation, the ability to control what you do with your own time, and bargaining power within the household. The intervention was this cook stove that you see on the lower left of the screen. So these were distributed free of charge. We partnered with a manufacturer based in Malawi. And the idea is that they actually still use firewood, but they just use less firewood or smaller pieces of firewood. You might ask, why would you not distribute a better cook stove than this one that you see here? For example, an electric cook stove or an LPG cook stove. Well, in many of the regions that we surveyed, electricity was either not available or it was very inconsistently available. And so an electric cook stove might not have been very useful. LPG is another popular cook stove intervention. In the regions that we surveyed, LPG wasn't available in the markets. Just pointing to the importance of making sure that your intervention is culturally relevant and can actually work in the region that you are in. Something that we think a lot about as development researchers is to try to give out products or intervene in ways that are sustainable in the long run. So we don't want someone to get a cook stove and then never use it again. So we think about the ease of transition frequently. So we studied 4 countries. We interviewed 1,000 women each in Tanzania, Malawi, Kenya, and Zambia. These are highly agricultural, rural, kind of income-poor regions that we surveyed. The study design is on the lower right side of your screen. You can see Kenya is omitted. That's because data collection is still ongoing in Kenya. So this is a classic RCT. At baseline, we selected 1,000 households, 1,000 women, each from Zambia, Malawi, and Tanzania. We split the sample in half randomly. The control groups did not receive the cook stove. The treatment group did receive the cook stove. We come back a little while later and resurvey all of those same individuals again. To survey them, we use a large household survey. I wanted to point out 2 important things about this survey. One, in each of our countries, of course, I was not going out and conducting 1,000 interviews. I don't speak the language, and I also don't live in the region. We partnered with 4 universities, 1 in each country, and had local university students or members of the community do our surveys for us, of course, all paid and comped. But the point here is that to avoid language and cultural barriers, we really tried to utilize people who actually live in the spaces that we were studying. And second of all, when we conduct survey work, we need to think about the population that we're interviewing. So you can see a list of things that we interviewed about, that we surveyed individuals on. But let's talk about this last one, which is called 3 measures of time use. So an example of a regionally relevant survey would be the picture that you see over on the left. So let's say that I ask you, someone that lives ostensibly in the United States, how long did you spend cooking yesterday? I think, including me, I actually don't know off the top of my head. I have to think about yesterday. I have to kind of calculate what time I was cooking and when I was done cooking. And imagine if you don't have access to a cell phone, to internet, or to a clock that you're regularly looking at. How are you going to know how much time you spent on something? And additionally, what if there are literacy issues? And so what you see in this picture is a different way of collecting time use information, where we placed pictures of common activity groups in front of respondents. Instead of asking them, how long did you spend on different activities? We gave them a set of tokens and asked them to distribute those tokens onto those activity cards to approximate how long they think they spent on each of those activities relative to other activities. So instead of thinking in terms of numbers, you're able to sort of abstractly and proportionally think about your time use. Okay, so let's talk about results. Hopefully I'm good on time. So first, the first result is that there are no results when we combine the data from all 3 countries. However, when we start to break this down by country, we do see results. So that tells us that the impact of these cook stoves was highly regionally dependent. So let's talk about Malawi first. In Malawi, we saw increases in time women spent on paid labor. And to sort of back up that result, we also saw increases in their own incomes. So that's a pretty positive result. I believe the increase in paid labor was something around 40 minutes per day, which makes sense. If you have children, you're doing childcare, you're maybe taking a part-time job at a local shop in the village or something like that. We also saw an increase in multitasking, so in the ability for our treatment group to multitask while cooking. And then next, we saw a decrease in time spent on unpaid labor. So this could be good or bad, right? So if your unpaid labor is like free labor working at someone's shop or like working on someone else's farm for no money, maybe spending less time on that is okay if you're now spending more time on paid labor. But sometimes unpaid labor often refers to working on your own farm and producing agricultural output, both for your own consumption and to sell. And so we can talk a little bit more about why that might be bad, looking at Zambia's results. So in Zambia, we again saw this increase in time spent on paid labor. We did not see a statistically significant increase in income, which is why I didn't write it here, but there was still a slight increase. We saw a decrease in time spent on collecting firewood. So that's really good. That's kind of the main point of this study. We saw a decrease in about an average of 30 minutes per day in the time spent collecting firewood. We also saw decreases in time spent on unpaid labor, but this time we saw a corresponding decrease in agricultural revenue, right? So that's not so good, especially because we didn't see that statistically significant increase in income. And then in Tanzania, we did not find any results. And I think there's a couple potential reasons for this, 2 strong contenders. In Malawi and Zambia, we were able to survey regions all over both countries. In Tanzania, we were limited because of implementation concerns to one small region in northwestern Tanzania, where there weren't too many paid labor opportunities for women. So even if you save time, if you can't find a job that, will take women, you're going to have to find something else to do with your time. The other issue in Tanzania was that there were only about 4 weeks between the intervention taking place in our treatment groups and us coming back in for our second round of surveys. So the time between individuals getting the new cook stoves and us providing surveys was very small, sometimes not enough time to see full results. Let's talk briefly about why these results might differ by region. So in both Malawi and Zambia, we saw that there were increases in time spent on paid labor. In both cases, there were generally paid labor opportunities for women. In Zambia, we saw a decrease in the time spent collecting firewood. We did not see that decrease in Malawi, even though we saw increases in time spent in other activities. What we found in our surveys were that many people in Malawi, in our Malawian sample, chose to purchase rather than collect fuel, oftentimes because markets were so much closer to them than forests were. On the other hand, in Zambia, the majority of our surveyed sample collected firewood. And then in both Malawi and Zambia, we saw a decrease in time spent on unpaid labor, but we only saw a decrease in agricultural revenue in Zambia. So in Malawi, what we found was that many of the crops didn't need the level of upkeep that the crops in Zambia needed. Again, just pointing to how subtle differences in things like agriculture can really make a big difference in the story that you find from your data. So because the crops require less upkeep, you might not lose too much agricultural revenue if you spend less time on your farm. Versus in Zambia, it was a quite bad cropping season with a bad drought. So we might see more of an impact to revenue in Zambia. So just a couple concluding remarks. Hopefully I'm good on time. What we found in general was that cook stoves can help rural women save time and access more opportunities, but regional characteristics are really important to consider when you are looking for the impacts of these different interventions. You can't just go in to one region expecting the same cook stove is going to perform well just because it performed well somewhere else. Which speaks to some of the difficulty in creating solutions that can be easily distributed amongst large populations. So things like agriculture mattered, things like availability of job opportunities mattered, even things like whether other cook stove companies were competing with us to get their cook stoves out first, that can make a difference. And then lastly, I think when doing research, especially in a country that you're not from, I'm not from East Africa, it's really important to be sensitive to cultural norms, language barriers, and really utilize and involve the local community if they would like to be involved. I think that that's sort of the most respectful and impactful way to go about doing this type of work. I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, let me know if you have any thoughts.